Hey guys, so from the previous devlog videos I've been doing lately, a few people messaged me asking how I did the grid system, and it was a bit hard to explain in text, so I figured I'd make a quick video. So I'm just kind of showing what I'm making in this video here. It's just this grid system that makes some cubes. Not doing much with it here, but I'll show how you can get different responses from the grid cells. In this case here, we're just clicking them to change the color. But it shows the basics of how you get something like a civilization game or a tactics game. Anything that uses a grid, and it doesn't have to be squares or anything like this. When we start in the video, it's going to be just a sprite. Then we change it to a cube. You could just as easily use like a hexagon grid, triangles, spheres, anything you want. So I'll show how you can kind of figure it out on your own. And if you guys like this, let me know and I'll make more. Okay, so here we have just a brand new empty project. The only thing I imported is just this little square rectangle that I made in Paint. You can make it in anything, do whatever you want. So I'm just showing here right now it's set to 256 by 256. So for the grid, what I want to do is set the pixels per unit to the same. That way one size of that, like one unit, will equal one grid in unit, or not one grid, but one unit space in Unity. So here I have the grid set to 5. So I'm going to make it that every grid space of the game is 5 Unity units. So let's just create an empty object here. So I'm just going to name this grid cell, and we're going to reset the transform on it there so it's at the center. And let's drag on this empty cell that we made. Okay, and we're going to want this to be 5 units. So we set this as 5, and it's based around the center, so we're just going to have to offset that right away. So we just got to go by half, so if we set it to 2.5 and 2.5 here. Okay, so now that matches our unit, so the bottom left corner will be the origin of each of these prefabs. And just drag this into your project here, make it into a quick prefab. Okay, and now we want to create another empty object here. And we're just going to name this one game grid. This is going to store the whole game on it. Or sorry, the game grid. Delete that prefab, we don't need that anymore. And let's reset this origin. Okay, and we want to add a script to this. So let's add component and we'll call it just game grid. Create that as a new script and open that up in C# or Visual Studio. Okay, so this is going to be used to make the actual game grid and store the items in an array that we can use here. So the first thing we're going to want to make is two private int variables. They don't necessarily have to be private, but might as well. So we're going to make a height. We'll just set that to 10 for right now. And then let's make a width as well. We're just going to set that to 10. And this will be the size of the game board or grid. Okay, and then we just want to add another one. We're going to make this one a float, and this is going to be the spacing between each cell, like how big they are. So we'll set this to 5, that way it matches exactly what our sprite is, and the grid will be perfectly aligned. There won't be any gaps between the spaces. Okay, and we're just going to make a grid array out of game objects. That's all we'll store in there for now. So we're making a 2D array, so if you don't know what that is, you just add the comma. And it's got 2 values. I'm not going to explain all the basics of like basic programming and everything in here, so otherwise it would take a really long time. So a lot of that stuff I'm just going to assume you know at this point. Okay, so let's make a method here. We're going to call it create grid. We'll call that in the start method as well, so that way when the game starts it automatically creates the grid. Okay, we're just going to make another game object up here. This one we're going to serialize so you see it in the inspector. And we'll call this one... let's just go with grid cell prefab. This is going to store in basically the object that we're going to instantiate to make the grid. So in this case, it's going to be that sprite prefab that we made there. Okay, so here the first thing we're gonna want to do is check to make sure that grid cell prefab's not empty. because if that's empty, nothing's going to work. So we'll just make a quick little if check here, and if it's null, we'll put an error message, and then we're just going to make it return out after this. Okay, so now we're going to start working on the loops. So we're going to need 2 loops here, one for the width and one for the height. It's pretty much a normal procedure for anything with a grid or 2D array, so you've probably seen this before. I'm just starting it with the Y first, because it's actually going to make the height first. That's all preference. You can change that to however you want. So now we're just making the width. Okay, and this is where we're going to actually start creating the grid cell. So we're going to use the game grid at position X and Y. And what we're going to do is instantiate that prefab. And for the position, we're going to use the X coordinate times the grid spacing, and then the Y times the Y spacing. And since we don't need the Z, you can leave that out and it'll just zero it out. And then for the rotation, we'll just use quaternion.identity just to empty out the rotation. I'll try fitting this on the screen better so you can see the whole thing. Okay, so next thing, we're just going to take that same grid position and we're just going to set its parent to this object. That way everything it spawns in the hierarchy of your game, it'll spawn as a child under the game grid, just to help keep it clean. Okay, and now that we have that, we're going to actually rename each one as well. So we're just going to change the name to show the X and the Y position. That way if you're looking for a specific one or troubleshooting or debugging, it makes it a lot easier to see. Okay, so let's just go back to Unity. It'll compile for a second. And before we do anything, I'm just going to run it and show you how that log error will work. So if we didn't put the prefab in there yet, you're going to get this log error message telling you. So it's just kind of a nice error check. So let's drag in that prefab, try it again. And did not actually work yet. Let's see what the issue is here. And we actually forgot to initialize the game grid array. So we just got to do that here. That should actually be game object, not game grid. Okay, so that'll initialize it. So now we should be able to run. Okay, so now it's running, it's creating the grid. Sorry about that too. I didn't realize until after I recorded the videos, my game view was on a separate monitor and it wasn't recording. So a lot of these I don't have the game view showing. But let's go into the sprite. I'm just going to show, now that we have the whole grid, we can just go in and you can modify this sprite anytime and just do things like change the colors. So if we run it now, it's going to be red. With the layout of this one, if you do it with the sprite, the only thing you'll notice too is the outline. Because all the other lines are doubled up, the outline will be a bit weaker on the outside. There's a lot of easy ways to fix that. I'm not going to bother with that in this video though. Okay, so now I'm going to start showing you some of the stuff you can actually do once you have a grid made. So let's go into our prefab here and let's add a script called grid cell. And then we'll open that up in your editor. Okay, and this is going to be a script on every cell in the game. So with this, you can pretty much do almost anything you want. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're just going to make a couple of variables. So I'm going to make a position X and a position Y. And this will just store the actual position on the grid that this cell is. This is just kind of so you can keep track of everything as you're using the grid system. You know where objects are, you know where the grid cell is. Okay, and we're going to make another variable here. And this is, we might not use this in this video, probably not, but I'm just showing a general structure you can do. is we're going to make this game object, and this is going to store a reference to anything that gets placed on this grid cell. So example, say if you had a chess game, this would store a reference to the piece that's on the game. And then we're going to make another one here. This is just a bool that just stores if it's occupied or not, because a lot of the time you won't care what's on that grid space. You only want to know is there something there or not, and then that way you know if you can place objects or move them there. Okay, so now we're going to make two methods here to help us with all of this. So the first one here is going to set the position of the grid space, so we can just pass in an X and a Y, and all it's going to do is assign those to position X, position Y. And then we're going to make another one to get the position, and this will just return the same values but as a vector2 int. That just makes it a lot easier to track values with a grid instead of always having to use an X and a Y. If you pass them as vector2 int, it'll just be one variable. Okay, so now that we have that, if we go back to the game grid script, we can actually add a line in here that will set that value every time it makes a cell. So we're just going to use game grid XY again, and then we're just going to assign those values, the X and Y, to the set position method. Now every game grid cell that gets made in here will have its own unique position and stored in that grid cell, so we can pull that data anytime we want. Okay, so over back into Unity now, we want to open the prefab for our grid cell here, and we need to add a box collider. So just add the component. We want to make it 5 units wide and height so it matches, and just move them by 2.5. That'll center it. Okay, we're going to start making some more helper methods here. One little mention, I made a change off video. I didn't even think of recording it, is the grid space size variable. It just started with a capital G. All I did was change that to a lowercase g. Other than that, nothing else changed here. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a method here. This one's going to be called getGridPosition from world. So what this will do is it's going to take any world position. You just pass in a vector3 and it's going to convert it to the grid. So for the X, we're using mathf.floor to int. So basically what this is going to do is take any floating point number, which will take the world position X divided by grid space size, and whatever is returned from that, it's going to basically remove anything after the decimal. It'll get the next lowest integer. And we're doing the same for the Y. Notice we used worldPosition.z though, because we're working with a 3D game and we're working on the basically using the Z as a Y position. So then all we do here is clamp them. So we're just clamping the X and the Y, so neither of them go either lower than 0 or above the width. Or, sorry, above the height. And just to mention, the worldPosition.x and the .z I did there, it really comes down to what coordinates you use in your game. And so yours, you might want to end up using X and Y. It just depends on which axis you work off of. Okay, and then all we did there was we returned that as a vector2 int again, and we're going to make another one here. This one's going to do the opposite though. We're going to pass in a grid position, and this will return the world position. So all we have to do here is we take in that vector2 int, and then we multiply each one by grid space size. And then we just return the vector3. Okay, now we're going to start working with some basic input. So let's make an empty object. We'll call it input manager. Let's add a script to it called input manager as well, and just open that up. And first thing we got to do is just get a reference to the game grid. So we're just going to make a game grid object, and then in start, we're just going to find that object, get a reference to it. One other quick thing to mention on the previous section too is making your helper classes static methods is very handy as well. That way in any other class you don't have to get a reference to the game grid, and you could still do conversions between grid spaces to world space and vice versa. So just wanted to add that in. That's one thing I always make little helpers like that are static. Okay, so here we're just going to make another method. What this one's going to do is we're basically going to return either the grid cell if the mouse is over it, or null if it's not over anything. So this one, again, I'm not going to explain in too much detail, but if you guys do want me to do more like beginner-friendly video series on this, it would have to be spread out a lot longer, but if you guys want that, just leave a comment and let me know, and I can make it complete beginner. There's no problem there. But yeah, essentially all we're going to do here is do a raycast from the camera, and we're just going to do that raycast to the grid, and it'll go from your mouse position through the camera. And then we're going to also have to set up a layer mask right away, and we'll set the grid to use that layer mask. That way it'll only hit anything on that layer mask, and the raycast won't care about anything else. Okay, so now that we made that, before we go any further here, I'm just going to set it to return null just to get rid of that error. So, we'll go back into Unity so it compiles, and we're just going to create that layer and then add it to the layer mask. So we'll just go here, let's call it grid cell. Okay, and then we're going to set our grid cells to that. So now they're on the grid cell layer. And now we're going to set that layer mask. Where was that again? All right, we're looking at the wrong object. So yeah, it's on input manager. So we're just going to set that layer mask to grid cell. And then this way, when that raycast happens, anything that's on the grid cell layer will get hit by it. Okay, so here we're just doing the actual raycast, and we're going to store everything in a hit info variable here. And now if it did hit something, we're going to return that, but we're going to need to get the grid cell component off of that object, and then we'll return that. So again, this isn't an optimal way to use this or anything. It's just something I could do quick for a video. So like some of these methods here of how we're going to return this and get components on other things, definitely not necessarily the best way to go, but it should at least give you a general idea of what you can do here. So now in input, or sorry, in update, we're going to check if that mouse is actually over an object. Okay, so here we're just going to save everything into this cell mouse is over object, and now we'll do a check on it. So if it's not null, what we're going to want to do is, for this example, we're just going to look for a mouse click. Okay, and then here on that mouse click, we're just going to get the mesh renderer component, and we're going to change its color. Actually, we got to change that to get component in children, because the sprite's a child in the prefab, and it's not actually a mesh, so we need the sprite renderer instead. And then here we can just set the color. So if we go back into Unity and run it, so now we have our grid. And again, I apologize. I totally didn't realize it wasn't recording my game screen on the other monitor. But here you can see I'm just kind of doing a little demo on the game screen. I'm just clicking on some of the tiles, and you can see some of them changing color there. Just getting a better camera placement. You can do whatever you want with the camera there. Okay, and just to make it easier to see, I'm just going to increase the height and width to 15 here, so it just makes the grid a bit bigger. This also shows you how easy it is to actually change your grid size anytime you want. It's just two variables, and there it is. So yeah, here in the game view, you can't see it, but I'm just clicking some random tiles, so you actually see them changing color here. And that's as simple as it is, it's actually up and working. Okay, so I'm just going to show some quick little uses, some common stuff here. So we're changing this, instead of changing the color, just going to debug out if the grid space is occupied when you click on it. This is something more realistic that you would use. So if you go here on the game view, I'm just clicking some random cells, and you can see in here it's actually popping up each time I click on one saying false, because right now they're all false. There's nothing saved on them. But you can see how easy it would be to make changes. Again, chess is a good example, or a game like Civilization, more the old versions, but it was a lot more like kind of grid and cell based. Okay, and just to change it up again, and this is just going to show again kind of how versatile something like this is. And it may look fairly boring in this video, but if you get a bit creative with it, you can do tons. So I'm just making a cube, just adding a color to it. We'll give it like a blue here. Okay, just make simple prefab out of it. And what I'm going to do is add a basic animation clip, just something super quick and cheesy, nothing fancy. So it's just going to have kind of like a little scale in and pop kind of thing to it. Okay, and all I'm doing is I'm replacing that grid cell we had before with this cube prefab. And we just have to add the script to it. Oops, we forgot to set the animator to not loop. Let's try that again. Okay, and that made basically a grid where they popped in. I'm just going to change that a bit here though. Okay, so it should have less space this time to look a bit better. Again, really apologize for that. Can't see the game view screen. Next time we'll get that, but you can see, so now there's no gap. So all the cubes look like one big plane right now. I'm just going to adjust that a bit. So I just adjusted to make it a bit slower, and you can kind of see how it loads in, but let's improve this a bit more. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change this create grid method to become a coroutine. And we're just going to start that. If there's an error, I'm going to make it return null. That will make it so it doesn't actually freeze, it just won't do anything. And we're going to make it wait for 0.1 second every time it makes a grid space. That looks kind of neat, but let's speed that up a bit more again. Let's try like 0.025. It should look a bit better. Okay, so yeah, you can kind of get a idea of what I was going for there, but yeah, you could easily do something like that and make it look kind of like a procedural level generation. So as it builds your grid, little buildings pop up here and there, and each one on their start could have a start animation. So you could have, like little trees on your grid, and when they start, they're flat and they pop up, things like that. You can really do anything you want at this point. So one thing I'm just going to do quick, I'm just going to hop in the script, and just like we did with the sprite, I'm going to change the mesh renderer color of the cube. And just kind of play around with some of the camera angles, find something that looks nice here. Okay, and you can see when I'm just randomly clicking around, now they're turning red. I'm just going to change the space a bit so everything's kind of have a little separation. You can see more here now. And this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to record a new video so you can see the game view, see what it looks like. Okay, so here's an actual game view screen I took of this. So I just kind of slowed it down a bit, got a better camera angle, made a black background. And you can kind of see like it could be a procedural world you create. Now here I'm clicking just to show you can select them. Like I said, everything in this video is, you know, kind of the intro, very basic to using a grid like this. But it comes in handy for a lot of things. I've done a lot of game jams where I made, you know, like tower defense games or something for the jam, and I would just make a big procedural grid like this, and then you can, you know, pop little things on whenever you want. And I'll actually show a little video one I made here right now. So yeah, this was a little tower defense game I made for a jam over, I think it was a week for this one. This wasn't the finished one, I just don't have a video handy. But basically the same idea for a grid, everything animates in, the objects kind of pop up from the ground, exact same concepts I showed in here. So there's a lot of things you can do with something like this, and very quick and easy once you get used to it. Alright, so yeah, I think that's long enough for a video here and kind of covered the basis of it. But yeah, if you have any questions, comments, anything like that, just leave a comment below, and hopefully subscribe and check out more videos, and I'll try to keep more updated stuff like this coming. Thanks.